Beloveds of God, welcome to Thursdays for the Soul. This has been a series every Thursday to care for the whole of the church, and our topics are wide-ranging. And today, in one full year of programming and liturgical programming, we step into Maundy Thursday together. So take a deep breath, prepare your hearts and minds, and join us in worship. The Christian tradition has been passed from generation to generation in the form of stories told and retold. Stories around dinner tables and campfires, on fishing boats and family road trips, in holy places and spaces where God's presence was wholly unimaginable until the moment the story was spoken out loud. Today, we are reminded that the human mind, as well as the body, respond to storytelling as a signal of closeness and intimacy, which allows both the tellers of the story and the listeners to create an emotional link that can link them into and assimilate them in memory. We enter into that story, which has been an unfolding during this Lenten season, wherever we are. So breathe, listen, and be. The upper room. It was just before Passover, and the majority of the disciples had made their way to Jerusalem. It was a busy city any time of the year, but at Passover, it was shoulder to shoulder. Can't see more than the shirt of the person in front of you. Don't let go of my hand or I'll never find you again kind of busy. As the Passover drew near, the disciples had logistics and holy hospitality at the forefront of their mind. Who was getting the groceries? What cleaning was left to be done? Where were they going to prep the food and eat together? Whether they were actually oblivious to the looming threat in the air or choosing to be in denial for a time is unclear. But determined to celebrate the holiday well, they rattled off all their planning questions. Jesus's response was simple: go and look for the man carrying a jar of water, which is not traditionally the job of a man. So go and look for the one being creative in all ways and expressions, and just follow him. The disciples blinked hard at this baffling direction for a few minutes. Go look for a single person around among thousands of people. Go search for a man doing work reserved for women. Go seek out the very someone most others pretend not to see. Follow them, trust them, abide with them. With every blink, the answer settled their busy minds, and the disciples set out to find the one whom Jesus spoke about.
The Last Supper. The hospitality had been beyond measure that night. Maybe it was the space, but more likely it was that they were all together that made them feel like home. Those hosting for the night had exchanged congratulating glances to one another that things had gone without a hitch, and exchanged congratulating glances to one another that the food was passed and shared and everything was going well. There was a different glance, though, exchanged between the hosts when Jesus went off script. Jesus took the bread, blessed it and broke it, began passing it around. That part was familiar. It was usual. It was ordinary. But his words were confusing and unfamiliar. This is my body. Each time that you eat this, remember me. Questions swirled in the disciples' minds. Why was Jesus ad-libbing the traditional liturgy? Why was he talking like he himself knew something about being broken? And what was it that they were supposed to remember? The sermons, the miracles, the parables, the palm protest, the overturning of tables, or his constant overturning of the status quo? No one dared to speak the questions aloud, though. The meal carried on, but truly the bread was still stuck near the lump in their throat when Jesus began ad-libbing a second time. He had wine in his hand, and as he poured it and passed the glasses around the table, he looked at them with compassion and care. "This cup holds my promise to you," he said. "Drink it and remember me." After the meal, they told story after story after story, remembering precisely where their journeys had begun and the memories they made along the way. While the gathering was still going, Judas quietly slipped away.
Gethsemane. The conversation among the disciples had been lively for a while, but as the meal settled in their stomachs, one of the disciples suggested they step out for a walk. An olive grove wasn't all that far away, someone noted, and it seemed good to everyone to get out from the city's bustling surge of energy, if only for a little bit. The night sky was beautiful. The moon was full and the stars bright. The disciples sat among the quietness of the trees and gazed upwards until their eyelids grew heavy. Jesus elbowed and nudged them, asking them to stay awake, but they were exhausted from travel and a meal and wine. And the disciples all said they just needed to rest their eyes for a few minutes. Jesus' whole body hummed with anxiety, though, the way that bodies do when threats on their life loom. He took a deep breath, trying to calm his nerves, and another to remind himself that he stood by his words, that he had done nothing wrong. His mind flashed back to the time he stood in the temple at the age of 12 and read the Isaiah scroll in front of the elders. Since all he had done was done in the name of creating the kingdom God envisions for us. With another deep breath, he rose to his feet and found a place to pray. Words of grief over the conditions of the world had barely left his lips, and tears were still in his eyes when Judas appeared right behind him with the guards. The charges weren't clear, and he didn't resist in the least, but that didn't stop those who beat him and mocked him, as if it were in the name of justice. After roughing him up, they led Jesus to where Caiaphas and the other high priests were waiting to meet.
The denial. Peter trailed behind at a distance, close enough to see what was going on, but far enough not to do anything about it. Jesus had called Peter the rock because Peter was strong and steadfast, unmovable and unshakable. But now, while Jesus was in the halls of power and with his own life on the line, Peter stood outside the gates in the deepness of the night, trying to make himself invisible. Someone nearby took notice of Peter standing off on his own, and they shouted a little bit so that their voice would carry and asked if he knew Jesus. Peter shook his head no and lowered his eyes. But a knowing soul recognized the rock. Yeah, I saw you with him, she said. Peter shook his head no and flashed an angry glare to silence her. Not sure that he was ready to admit to risk his own well-being for that of another, he stood nervously, shifting his weight from side to side. Each time he shifted his decision between staying put and running. The wise group of women watched as the rock uneasily rocked back and forth. It was a man's voice that broke that knowing silence. With booming assertions, he explained what was already clear. I know I've seen you with Jesus. The others rolled their eyes at the performance, but Peter could not keep it all bottled up anymore and shouted a third denial of who he was and of what he stood for right as the rooster crowed.
The trial. The trial was all for show. The outcome and sentence had been determined long before the venue and jury selected. Jesus had changed from the ringleader of 12 goofy guys that no one much liked anyway, to the leader of a movement that gave leadership to women and looked upon the poor with care, that spoke about the need for health care and that no one should have to wait even an extra day to find the healing care they need, that called for care of immigrants and refugees, and that spoke in parables and words plain as day, that unless you care for your neighbor as yourself, you are not living God's commandments, no matter what else you do. And now, he and his movement drew thousands of listeners anywhere they went. Those in power and those who wanted to remain in power met and determined the easiest way forward. A quick trial, then a request to the governor to carry out the execution sentence. They determined if the governor wouldn't go along with it, they'd make a request of Herod himself.
the cross as Jesus slowly bled to death. It seemed as if the whole world just gathered to make fun of this absurd notion that things could change, that the world could embrace anything other than the empire, that inclusivity was available if eyes and hearts and minds were open to it. And then he took his last breath.